When I was 21, my sister told me I was an embarrassment to the family. She said it softly, but it landed like a blade. 2 weeks later, my father changed the locks. My mother left a bag of my clothes on the porch. No goodbye, no explanation, just silence. They said I was reckless, emotional, unfit. But the truth is, I just couldn't stay quiet about what they did. For 12 years, I disappeared. I changed my name, cut my hair, erased every trace of who I was. Not because I was ashamed, but because I knew they'd never let me rise if they knew I had. Then one afternoon, I walked into a courtroom where my sister was on trial. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The judge paused, squinted toward the back, and asked, "Wait, is that Elena Cruz, the governor?" Every head whipped around. My sister's mouth fell open, and in that suspended moment, all the years I spent buried under their silence cracked open into something else. They used to say I was a failure, but now the only thing louder than their silence was the sound of the world finally seeing me. I'm about to share something close to my heart. But before I do, can you say hi in the comments or tell me where you're from? I love hearing how far my story reaches. It's always good to know I'm not alone in this. And if my voice resonates with you even a little, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter. Thank you. And now let me tell you everything. The air in Tucson was thick with heat, and inside the Vegas home, it was thick with expectation. The family had gathered around the dining table, polished wood reflecting the soft glow of the chandelier above. It was a Sunday dinner, a tradition Javier Cruz upheld with military precision. At the head of the table sat Javier himself, retired police chief, patriarch, and commander of all things honorable. He raised a glass to Sophia, his firstborn, as her image flashed across the muted TV screen behind them. "That's my girl," he said proudly. District attorney for Maricopa County and now featured on CNN, a real Cruz. Elena sat at the far end, fork poised over her plate, eyes downcast. No one looked her way. No one asked how her graduation went. She had walked the stage last month with a degree in humanities. Not law, not pre-med. She hadn't even told them the date. She knew they wouldn't come. She had always been the strange one, sketchbooks instead of legal pads, Rilke and Simone Weil in her backpack. She read philosophy in parks, painted at dawn, and sat quietly through family meals like a distant echo of someone who used to matter. Elena was 25, brilliant in ways they didn't understand and never tried to. Then came the storm. It started with a ping on her phone, a text from a friend, then another, then a voicemail she didn't even want to hear. By the time she opened her laptop, it was everywhere. A private video of her taken during spring break was now public. Her face, her body, her voice, all stolen, uploaded, and shared. The one behind it, her ex-boyfriend, bitter and vengeful after she ended things. She hadn't known he still had the video. Elena didn't even have time to cry before her world collapsed. Sophia found it first. That much Elena only learned later. She had sent it straight to Javier with a single line. "You need to act before this gets worse." Not to protect Elena, but the family name. Dinner that night never happened. Javier stormed into Elena's room, fury curling off him like smoke. "You think we raised you for this? For the world to see you like a damn—" He didn't finish. He didn't have to. "I didn't post it," Elena choked out. "I was the one violated." "You violated the name Cruz," he snapped, tossing her university diploma onto the bed like a bill he refused to pay. "You want to live like trash? Then do it without my name, my roof, or my money." Her mother, Maria, stood at the doorway, her rosary wrapped tightly around her fingers. She said nothing, wouldn't even meet Elena's eyes. Elena turned to Sophia, maybe hoping for something, anything. But her sister just stood still, hands folded, gaze cold, not even a blink. Elena packed in silence. A few clothes, her sketchbooks, her journals, the red backpack she'd carried since freshman year. Sunlight filtered in through the blinds, slicing the room into shadows. When she walked into the living room, Javier was waiting. He placed her bank card on the table. "Don't call," Don't write." Her mother peeked from behind the curtain as Elena stepped out into the sweltering dusk. She didn't wave, didn't speak, just watched. The first week, Elena slept in her friend's car. Then her friend's kindness wore thin. By day 9, she was on a Greyhound heading north. Boise, maybe, or somewhere quieter, somewhere no one would care who she used to be. On the third night of that journey, beneath an overpass just outside Flagstaff, Elena did something small and final. She took out an old leather-bound notebook, one that held family birthdays, home recipes, notes her mother used to leave in her lunchbox. She tore each page slowly and fed them to a small flame until there was nothing left but ashes. The why? Night was still, the flame soft and hungry. Elena stared into the glow, then turned to the rearview mirror of the bus idling behind her. She saw her reflection, tired, betrayed, burning, and she whispered, "I've got nothing left to lose, so I'll start with what's left of me." Boise was gray that winter, and the cold had a way of crawling through clothes, skin, and whatever. Hope Elena had left. She lived in a shared apartment, one of those run-down buildings with peeling paint, rust-stained sinks, and thin walls that coughed every sound into your bones. Rent was cheap, heat unreliable. Her room was barely wide enough for a mattress, a folding table, and one cracked mirror, but it was hers. Elena worked constantly. In the mornings, she served pancakes at a diner off Lincoln Avenue, memorizing orders and names she'd forget the moment she clocked out. Afternoons, she cleaned a local medical clinic, scrubbing floors still sticky with childhood coughs and aging hopes. Evenings were spent hunched over a second-hand keyboard, inputting data for a logistics firm that didn't know her last name. At night, when the noise settled and the silence pressed against her ribs, she wrote, not full words, just fragments in a code she made up as a child, a diary only she could understand. It was her way of bleeding without leaving stains. Each page she filled was a whisper she wasn't brave enough to say aloud. She painted too. Not often. Paint was expensive. But one night, after a particularly brutal shift, she used an old toothbrush dipped in dollar store acrylics to create a piece that looked like a body collapsing into its own shadow. She hung it in the far corner of the room behind the curtain. No one ever asked about it. That felt right. Then came the scissors. One morning, without warning, she cut her hair in the bathroom mirror, strands falling into the sink like dead petals. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a breakdown. It was a decision. A shedding. She registered a new name at the local job board. LC. Just enough to hide in plain sight. Just enough to become someone new. One night at the clinic during a graveyard shift, Elena heard shouting in Spanish. She stepped into the hallway and saw a woman, small and terrified, holding a child while a uniformed officer hovered over her, with a stack of papers. "Firma aquí," the officer barked. "It's already processed. Just sign." The woman didn't understand. Or maybe she did, but panic froze her. Elena stepped in, heart hammering. "She's not signing that," she said, her voice sharp. "Who the hell are you?" "She's not signing," Elena repeated. She grabbed the form. "Your software is outdated. These papers are invalid." It was a lie, but it worked. The officer hesitated, grumbled, then left. The woman cried quietly into her daughter's jacket. Later that week, Elena was called into a small office where she half expected to be fired. Instead, she found herself sitting across from a man named Diego Martinez, director of Libertad Ahora, a nonprofit helping undocumented immigrants. "You know, most people don't do what you did," he said. "I know," Elena replied. "Most people still have something to lose." He smiled. "Come work for us, not as a cleaner." Elena started at the bottom again. She fetched coffee, translated documents, ran errands. But she watched, she learned. She began drafting proposals, then writing community outreach plans. Eventually, she coordinated grants and balanced budgets. She took online policy courses at night, studied immigration law on weekends, sat in on city council meetings just to understand the language of power. She never used the word home again, not out loud. But one day after securing emergency housing for a family of 5 who had fled cartel violence, a young intern asked her, "Why do you do this?" Elena paused. She didn't need to think. "I Don't have a family to go back to, she said. So I'm building a place where I might belong. And somehow, in the spaces between doing good and staying invisible, Elena began to remember how to breathe again. 4 years after the night Elena tore a deportation order from a frightened mother's hands, she stood in a wood-paneled city hall chamber, speaking with a voice so calm it carried like thunder. She had become a familiar presence in Boise's immigrant advocacy world. Sharp, relentless, unapologetically principled. Her reputation wasn't loud, but it was solid. People listened when she talked, even those who didn't agree with her. Now she was no longer just the girl who once cleaned exam room floors. Elena had earned a place on the local Immigration Policy Advisory Council. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't come with a motorcade, but it was real power. The kind that shapes legislation before anyone realizes it's law. The meeting that day was tense. A conservative councilman, his tie starched, his jaw permanently clenched, was advocating for increased ICE cooperation in Boise shelters. Elena, seated at the end of the panel, waited for him to finish. Then she leaned forward, her voice steady. If the law refuses to grow with justice, she said, then justice stops being lawful and starts being ornamental. The room went quiet. A few people clapped. The councilman didn't respond. Afterward, a journalist from the Idaho Times approached her in the hallway. Young, eager, sharp-eyed. "We'd love to do a piece on you," he said. "Local leader, immigrant advocate, the face of change, that kind of thing." Elena blinked. Something in her stomach turned. "Only if you don't use my full name," she said. He looked puzzled, but nodded. "No headshot, and you can call me E. Cruz." He paused, then nodded. "Okay, why the secrecy?" Elena smiled politely, but her eyes didn't. "I've already been seen in the wrong ways." That night, back in her small studio apartment, no longer the crumbling place she first landed in, but still modest, she lit a candle. She did this every night, always in front of the same photograph. It was an old family portrait, except she had scraped off her own face with a coin. What remained was a ghostly blur where her smile used to be. She whispered the same words she did every evening before blowing out the flame. Be remembered for what you do, not what they called you. Some nights she wondered if her mother still kept photos of her, or if her father had told anyone. She was alive. She didn't Google them, didn't check their social media. The distance was intentional, and it was necessary. Healing wasn't always forward motion. Sometimes it was building walls tall enough that you could grow wild inside. Them. One of her colleagues at Libertad Ahora, an older black woman named Lillian who had worked in city government for 3 decades, once asked her, "You ever think about letting people know who you really are?" Elena shrugged. "They know who I am. I mean, your past." Elena shook her head gently. "I'm not hiding. I'm just not ready to be seen by people who used to look right through me." The truth was she feared more than being found. She feared being recognized and misinterpreted, becoming the story instead of the voice. But progress has a way of chasing the people who try to move silently. A few weeks later, Elena stood behind a modest podium at a public park event. The crowd wasn't huge, maybe 80 people, but they were listening. When she announced her intention to run for the Idaho State House of Representatives as an independent candidate, her voice did not tremble. "I'm not here to represent a party," she said. "I'm here to represent the people who are never invited to the table, but who carry it on their backs every day." She didn't bring up her childhood. She didn't tell them she used to sleep in her car. She didn't show glossy family photos. Her campaign materials were clean, policy-focused, and featured no smiling headshot, just a slogan, "Let the work speak first." And with that, Elena stepped into a different kind of fight. Not just for others, but for herself, for the right to rebuild without asking permission, without apologizing, and without being seen unless she wanted to be. It started as a headline Elena hadn't expected to see: District Attorney under investigation for evidence tampering. The name below was all too familiar: Sophia Cruz. Elena hadn't said that name out loud in years, hadn't allowed it to live in her mouth. But there it was, printed in bold, unavoidable. The story broke over a weekend. A whistleblower accused Sophia of manipulating evidence in an immigration trial involving a mother from Guatemala facing deportation. It was being called a betrayal of justice by activists and a witch hunt by Sophia's legal allies. The stakes were high: disbarment, a criminal indictment, and possibly jail time. For Elena, it was like hearing a distant explosion, loud enough to feel in her chest, yet too far away to do anything about. Her press team reacted swiftly. "We recommend you remain neutral," said one advisor. "You're a sitting governor. This could get messy." Another chimed in, "It's not your fight. Let it play out." But Elena didn't see it that way. Not because she wanted to defend Sophia. God, no. But because there were too many ghosts in that courtroom, and one of them bore her name. She booked a flight to Tucson with no press announcement, no security entourage. She didn't tell a soul. When she arrived at the courthouse, she wore black slacks, a nondescript coat, and sunglasses. She entered through a side door and took a seat in the last row, where the shadows lived. The courtroom was cold, almost clinical. Lawyers shuffled papers. Reporters whispered into tiny microphones. Sophia sat at the front, impeccable as always, her posture straight, her lips pressed into that old familiar line Elena knew too well. She looked untouchable, controlled, but there was tension in her hands. Then Judge Evelyn Carter entered. Elena remembered her. Evelyn had spoken at a national governor's conference 3 years ago, a commanding black woman with a razor intellect and an intolerance for nonsense. She took her seat behind the bench, scanning the room like she always did. Her eyes landed on Elena. A pause, a double take. Then, "Wait, is that Elena Cruz, the governor?" Silence. Every head turned. The journalists near the front gasped. Cameras swiveled. Reporters whispered frantically into phones. Someone raised a lens. Flash. Sophia's head jerked back toward the gallery, her eyes locked on Elena. Eyes that once rolled with disdain, now wide with disbelief. Maria Cruz, seated stiffly next to her daughter, turned white as chalk. Her hand flew to her chest. She whispered something, perhaps a prayer or a curse. Javier Cruz leaned forward, squinting, as if trying to decipher whether the ghost of a daughter he disowned had returned to haunt him in flesh and power. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't nod, didn't wave, just sat still, spine straight, as if her very existence in that room was enough of a statement, which it was. The judge cleared her throat, composed herself, and the proceedings resumed. But the air never quite settled after that. Every few minutes, someone stole a glance back. The governor was in the room, and she wasn't there to save anyone. Photographers clicked without shame. One tried to get closer until a bailiff waved him back. Elena ignored them. She had come to witness, not to interfere, not to offer comfort, not even to speak. She stayed until the adjournment, then rose from her seat and walked out the side door the same way she came. No one called after her. No one followed. By the time she returned to her hotel, her phone was already buzzing with missed calls, texts, and voicemails from press outlets she hadn't heard from in years. Her face was on the news. Her name was trending. But this time, it wasn't scandal or shame that brought her there. It was presence. She sat by the window that night, watching the lights of the city she used to call home. Her reflection in the glass no longer looked like a shadow, but something heavier, something seen. Elena Cruz had come back not as a daughter, not as a sister, but as a reckoning. It didn't take 48 hours for Elena's name to dominate the news cycle. Her return to the courtroom had cracked open a vault no one had touched in over a decade. Every outlet had their own spin. Idaho governor's secret past, estranged sister of indicted prosecutor, from scandal to Senate, the Elena Cruz redemption arc, the forgotten Cruz. Is Elena the real star of this family? And then the real storm. Hit. Someone unearthed the clip, the old grainy video. The one she thought had vanished into internet oblivion, reappeared, pixelated, but unmistakable. Elena at 25. A spring break rental. A boy with a phone and too much ego and the world watching. The headlines turned sharper, harsher. One talk show even interviewed her ex-boyfriend, who smiled sheepishly and said, "We were young. She knew I had the footage. I didn't think it would go this far." Elena watched the segment alone in her office, her hands still, her face blank. She didn't flinch. She didn't call for damage control. She let it air. Let it burn, because she was done running. Her staff scrambled. Should we issue a statement? We can threaten legal action. Should we shut it down? Elena said no to all of it. She simply whispered, "Let them look. I've survived being seen before." Then, Javier Cruz called. His voice, always sharp, still carried the weight of command, like she was 18 again, being scolded for wearing lipstick. "You're using our name for your own gain," he said coldly, "dragging our legacy through the mud for attention." Elena leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping the edge of her desk. "I've carried that name longer than you carried me," she said evenly. "I didn't ask to be a Cruz. I stayed one to remind myself who not to become." Click. He hung up. That night, Maria Cruz was rushed to the hospital with a blood pressure spike. Elena found out through a quiet call from her cousin in Tucson. Against every instinct, she booked a red-eye flight. She entered the hospital room without announcement. Her mother looked so small. Not the stern woman who used to cross herself before every meal and tell Elena to speak softer, smile more. Just a tired body in a gown, hands trembling under a thin blanket. Their eyes met. "Elena," Maria whispered. Her voice was brittle, like it would shatter if she raised it. Elena didn't move, didn't speak. "If what they say is true," Maria said slowly, "then I've spent years not seeing you." Tears welled in the old woman's eyes. But Elena didn't cry. She sat down beside her, took her mother's hand gently, and held it in silence. Not as a daughter seeking forgiveness, not as someone offering it, just as herself. She didn't say, "I forgive you." That would have been too neat, too easy. Elena had learned that healing sometimes comes without permission, without a declaration. When Maria drifted into sleep, Elena reached into her bag and pulled out a small canvas. She left it on the bedside table. It was a painting she'd done months ago. A woman standing in a desert, her silhouette stretching long and disproportionate behind her. It was titled, "Witness." Elena walked out without leaving a note. Back in Idaho, the media frenzy hadn't calmed. Journalists waited outside her office. Editorials speculated about her past. Camera crews camped near her residence. She gave no interviews, no tweets, no curated statements, but she didn't retreat either. At the next scheduled cabinet meeting, she entered the room with her usual calm. Her staff looked tense, the room thick with expectation. She stepped up to the podium. "I won't rewrite the past," she said, voice clear, unwavering. "But I will decide how it gets used from here on out." Then she opened the meeting. No one dared ask questions. She had spoken. And that silence, earned, owned, and undeniable, was louder than any headline they could print. The indictment landed on every news channel like a slow-burning scandal finally set alight. Sophia Cruz, once the golden prosecutor of Arizona, now faced criminal charges for tampering with evidence in a high-profile immigration case. Legal circles that once praised her cut ties quietly, like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Whispers turned to statements. Former colleagues gave carefully worded press quotes, calling the allegations deeply concerning, a betrayal of public trust. Her name, once spoken with pride, now clung to shame. Elena watched it all from Idaho, stone-faced. And then the phone rang. Her mother's name flashed on the screen. Maria's voice was thin, trembling like wind through dry leaves. "Mija," she said, already crying. "Please, just come home just once. Come for dinner." Elena didn't answer immediately. Later that night, another message arrived. This time from Javier. Not a phone call, not even a voicemail, just a text. "We need to talk." 12 years. 12 years of silence, of pretending she didn't exist, and suddenly they all remembered her number. Against every instinct, Elena said yes. That Friday, she arrived at the Vegas house just before sundown. The porch looked smaller than she remembered, like it had shrunk with age. Inside, the furniture was polished, the air thick with lemon oil and nervous energy. They were all there. Maria opened the door with a trembling smile, mascara already smudging at the corners. Javier stood behind her, stiff in a freshly ironed shirt. Sophia sat at the far end of the table, head bowed, fingers nervously turning a napkin. The seat reserved for Elena was the same old chair she had once sat in as a girl, but it had been reupholstered. New leather stitched tight, a shiny coat over a splintered frame. The meal was elaborate: enchiladas, arroz rojo, fresh tortillas, and wine no one touched. Maria tried to fill the silence with stories from the past. "Remember when you used to draw on the napkins?" she asked, voice falsely bright. Javier added, "Your campaign posters were very professional. I read one of your speeches. Quite impressive." Elena sat still, observing, listening, measuring. Eventually, Sophia spoke, voice quiet. "I know I messed up. I never thought it would go this far." There it was. Then came the shift. "We were thinking," Maria said, reaching for Elena's hand but stopping short. "Maybe you could say a few words to the federal prosecutor. Just a small recommendation. Nothing formal. Just help family." Elena looked around the table at her mother, tears clinging to hope like a child clutching a threadbare blanket. At her father, eyes sharp despite the false softness in his tone. At Sophia, once the architect of her exile, now reduced to silent desperation. She put her fork down slowly. The click echoed like a judge's gavel. "If I weren't the governor," Elena asked, voice level and unblinking, "would I still be your blood?" No one spoke. The silence was deafening. She stood up. The air felt lighter the moment she pushed back the chair. The new leather squeaked. "I kept your name," she said softly. "But I built my life without you in it." She turned, coat brushing her calves as she walked to the door. Maria called out, voice cracking, "Elena, please." But Elena didn't look back. She stepped outside into the night air, crisp, dry, and clear. For the first time, she didn't carry the weight of that house with her, only her own. The text came at 4:15 a.m. Elena woke with a start. Her phone buzzed again. One image, then another, then a flood. Grainy screenshots of the old spring break video. Private email exchanges from her early 20s. A photo of her crying outside a Boise shelter in year 2. No caption, no sender. She stared at the screen in the dark, pulse steady. Not fear, just calculation. By 10 a.m., her communications director knocked on her office door, pale-faced. "We've got something," she said, sliding a tablet across Elena's desk. There it was again, a blog post already circulating with the headline, "The Real Elena, Leaked Files from the Governor's Past." She didn't flinch. At 1 p.m., a discreet call came through from an old friend now stationed in the Justice Department. "You didn't hear it from me," the voice said, "but your father's been asking questions, background vetting." Someone whispered, "He's trying to find leverage." Elena closed her eyes for a beat, then opened them with focus sharper than glass. This wasn't concern. It was warning, or worse, a soft threat. That evening, instead of waiting for the storm to reach her doorstep, Elena walked straight into it. The next morning, she stood before a podium in Boise. No flags behind her, no security detail flanking her shoulders, just her. A wall of artwork from immigrant children she'd helped over the years and a single white spotlight. She wore a crisp white blazer, no jewelry, clean lines, her hair tucked behind her ears, a woman unarmed but untouchable. "We've all seen how power works," she began. "It doesn't always come in the form of violence or laws. Sometimes it arrives in whispers, in reminders of who your father is, in threats disguised as family dinners." She paused. "Well, this bill is for anyone who's ever had their past used against them by people who were supposed to protect them." She introduced the Justice Witness Protection Bill, a proposal to criminalize any attempt to manipulate public figures, whistleblowers or officials through familial pressure, past relationships, or reputation threats. It was bold, personal, and unmistakably pointed. She didn't name names, but every outlet knew. Every lawmaker knew. Every member of the Cruz family knew. The media exploded again, but this time they weren't dragging her. They stood behind her. Editorials praised the bill as long overdue. Op-eds commended her poise in the face of generational intimidation. Headlines shifted. Governor Cruz redefines political armor. She fought her family. Now she fights for the silenced. Javier Cruz, silent. Maria, no calls. Sophia, no texts, no reach-outs, no one dared. Elena walked the streets of Boise later that week like any other citizen. No reporters in tow, no cameras following her. Just a quiet woman in a navy coat, coffee in hand, crossing 12th and Elm under the soft golden light of fall. No one stopped her. No one called her name. And she smiled. I like it this way, she thought, because I don't need to be remembered. To keep doing what no one else dares to. It was just past 1 p.m. when Elena's assistant gently knocked. Ma'am, Sophia Cruz is in the lobby. Elena looked up from her notes. Did she make an appointment? No, she just asked to see you alone. There was a pause, a long one. Elena nodded once. Send her in. She cleared the desk of everything but a single glass of water. No cameras, no aides, no security. When Sophia entered, she looked like a shadow of the woman from courtrooms past. No makeup, dark circles under her eyes, a plain blouse and jeans, and shoulders that barely held themselves up. Elena said nothing. The silence grew thick. An old silence, familiar, but long buried. Sophia sat down across from her. I didn't know how to start, she said quietly. But I know I ruined what we could have had as sisters before I even realized I was jealous of you. Her voice broke, but she kept speaking. I don't want to go to prison, but I'm not here to ask you to fix it. I just wanted to tell you the truth. I stepped on you to climb higher, and now I look up, and you're somewhere I can't even see the ceiling of. Elena watched her, calm, unreadable. You didn't destroy me, Sophia, she said evenly. You just forgot I existed, and when someone is forgotten long enough, they remember how to become unforgettable. Tears spilled down Sophia's cheeks. Mom still believes you'll save me. Elena turned her head slightly, looking out the tall windows of her office at the city beyond. I'm not here to save anyone, she said. I saved myself so no one could drown me again. Sophia nodded slowly. Her voice softened. Thank you for not hating me more than I deserve. Elena didn't reply. There was no hug, no forgiveness, no final embrace. Just an honest silence between two women who once shared a room, a bloodline, and years of invisible damage. As Sophia stood to leave, her hand brushed the edge of Elena's desk. There, nearly hidden beneath a folder, lay a piece of paper, an unsigned letter, a plea for clemency Elena had once written and burned that very morning after remembering a different kind of call from 12 years ago. One where a sister had whispered to their father, "She's the one in the video." The door clicked shut behind Sophia. Elena sat back down, opened the next draft of her judicial reform package, and began to write again. Some legacies, she thought, can't be rewritten, but they can end with you. The conference was unlike anything Elena had ever spoken at before. It wasn't grand, it wasn't dramatic, but it was a room full of silenced history waiting to exhale, a statewide gathering on family justice reform, panels on whistleblowers who had exposed corruption within corporations, political institutions, and most painfully within families. Survivors who had once been daughters, sons, partners, employees, all punished not for lying, but for telling the truth too close to home. Elena stood backstage watching as the final introductory video played. A montage of faces blurred for safety, voices disguised, captions recounting betrayals by fathers, husbands, bosses, blood. The moderator introduced her simply. Governor Elena Cruz, advocate, reformer, daughter. She stepped forward into a quiet that hummed with weight. Her voice was steady from the start. I was once called a disgrace, she began. Then I was erased. Then I was threatened. Not with guns, but with memories. People leaned in. I'm not here to make anyone apologize to me. I'm here so that my future children won't feel like loving their truth means betraying their bloodline. She paused, scanning the crowd. Her eyes landed briefly on her mother. Maria sat in the third row, older, smaller somehow, her hands clasped tightly. She didn't speak, but tears streaked silently down her face. Farther back, almost hidden by shadows, sat Javier. No suit, no badge, just a man in a plain shirt, arms crossed over his chest like a shield that no longer worked. Sophia wasn't there, but in the front row, an empty seat bore a single printed sign reserved for who she once hoped to be. Elena smiled at the subtle gasps that rippled through the room. Then came the twist. "I'd like to announce a new policy," she said. "It's called the Public Kinship Act, or what I call the Family Transparency Clause. Under the new legislation, public employees would be allowed to declare familial relationships that posed a conflict of interest without fear of retaliation, demotion, or being branded disloyal. It was a way to protect whistleblowers, not just from strangers, but from those who shared their DNA. Because silence, Elena said, should not be the price of belonging." The press caught on like wildfire. Finally, some headlines read, "A leader who names the wound before it festers." The speech was streamed live across the country. Some applauded, some cried, some called it too personal for politics. But for once, no one called her the disgraced sister of a disgraced prosecutor. Not anymore. As Elena walked off stage, no flowers awaited her, no thunderous applause, just a quiet, grounded sense that she had pulled something out of the ground and turned it into a seed. She didn't need to erase the name Cruz. She had simply rewritten what it meant. 7 months later, Elena entered a small community center in North Boise. No press, no podium, no fanfare. Just 50 folding chairs and a crowd of locals gathered for what they thought was another nonprofit panel on leadership. No one expected the governor to walk in, wearing jeans, a long gray cardigan, and no staff trailing her. She didn't head to the front immediately. She helped move a few chairs, poured herself coffee, smiled as if she belonged there, because, in many ways, she did. When it was time to speak, she stepped forward. No title on the screen, no grand introduction, just 3 words in chalk behind her: ruthless leadership. She began softly, but her words struck like flint. "People ask, me all the time, how did you make it without your family's support?" A pause. "I didn't make it. I just stopped waiting for them." Laughter bubbled, soft but real. "We don't choose our blood," she continued, "but we get to choose what legacy we carry forward, and maybe more importantly, which ones we lay down." Someone raised a hand, a woman in her 60s, with silver at her temples and years of burden in her posture. "What if one day," the woman asked, "they really change? What if they come back different?" Elena tilted her head, considering. "I'll let them tell their story," she replied, warm and calm. "But I've already told mine, and I'm not rewriting it." The audience was quiet again, this time with the hush that comes when something true settles in your chest. That was when Elena noticed him. Javier standing at the very back next to the wall. No suit, no expression of authority, just an old man watching his daughter speak from a place he'd never helped her reach. She kept speaking, but her eyes held his for a moment. Not defiant, not hurt, just clear. When the event ended, people clapped. Not out of obligation, but recognition. As they dispersed, Javier walked slowly toward the front. Not many noticed. No camera turned. He waited his turn at the mic. Elena stood still, unreadable. "I never understood my daughter," he said, a long breath. "But today I realized maybe I don't have to. Maybe all I need to do is admit that she did what I never could. And I see her now. No apology, no explanation. Just that." Elena didn't cry. She didn't rush to embrace him. She simply bowed her head. The gesture, full of peace, not surrender. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall. Children ran across the frozen park nearby, chasing each other through the playground. Elena stepped out into the soft white light. She didn't look back, didn't wave goodbye, just kept walking, alone, but not lonely through the hush of the early winter air. She had once lived just to be seen. Now she had finally learned to see herself. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight quietly within ourselves against the weight of the past. But healing isn't about rewriting what's been done. It's about refusing to carry it any further. We don't choose where we come from, but we do choose where we stand. And sometimes standing alone is the beginning of something unbreakable. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to walk this path with me again, hit subscribe and stay close. Thank you for being here.